The effects of that attack at this door were quickly catastrophic. As the ammonia hits Andrew Foster's windpipe, it caused asthma and then a heart attack and then brain damage. But it was almost 24 hours before he died.
Your attack upon Andrew Foster had devastating and irreversible consequences. He was a much-loved young man, a gentle, funny and caring partner and son, with many years of his life ahead of him. All the possibilities of his future life with his family and friends were cut off by the attack in which you all...
In the web of human destinies, some threads snap quietly, others tear apart with a crack, leaving behind blood and ruin. This story belongs to the second kind. August 20th, 2023. Not a dark alley, not a gangster's den, just an ordinary house on a quiet street. While peaceful people slept, evil walked up to a door and knocked. For the man inside, it was the last familiar sound of his world. What followed wasn't a scream, but a hiss, a chemical fire eating through flesh and air alike. This wasn't rage, and it wasn't chance. It was business, cold, ruthless, paid for not with money, but with a human life. The silence that wrapped around Rectington on that August evening was almost tangible. 11 p.m., the hour when lights in the windows go dark one by one, and the streets surrender to sleep. Inside a house on Avon Terrace, 26-year-old Andrew Foster was hardly expecting company. But then, a knock, sharp, relentless, the sound that tore through the night's stillness and marked the beginning of an irreversible tragedy. When Andrew opened the door, he wasn't greeted by a friend or a neighbor. He looked straight into the eyes of mercilessness. The next moment, a jet of caustic liquid struck his face. Ammonia. The air in his lungs turned into fire, his vision into a blinding veil of unbearable pain. He staggered back, desperate for breath, but every gasp only brought a new wave of agony. He collapsed to the floor, while two masked figures calmly stepped over his body. Andrew was not their target. What they wanted lay in his kitchen. They moved fast, efficient, as if they already knew exactly what to take and where to find it. And when their work was done, they vanished into the night, leaving behind a man dying in unimaginable torment. That evening became the climax of a brutal campaign of violence, one that had kept South Tyneside's underworld in fear for weeks. The police who arrived at the scene didn't yet realize this wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated killing, the final link in a chain of horrifying crimes. To understand why Andrew Foster became a target, you have to look past the facade of his ordinary life. To those around him, he was a quiet 26-year-old, living with his girlfriend, Katie Harrison. Friends described him as easygoing, non-confrontational, the kind of man who never looked for trouble. But beneath that surface, there was another side, a darker one. Andrew wasn't just dabbling in drugs. He had carved out a dangerous niche. He wasn't only a dealer, he was a producer. In his own kitchen, he transformed bulk cannabis into edible products, a popular, highly profitable commodity in certain circles. It wasn't a large-scale operation, but it was steady, and that stability came at a price. Dependence on suppliers who neither forgave debts nor tolerated disobedience. In the months before his death, Andrew found himself trapped in the middle of a bitter conflict. He believed his supplier, Yousef Wynn, owed him nearly £60,000 from a shared cannabis crop. The money never came. What came instead were threats and violence. Once, he was beaten brutally. Another time, he was robbed. and he was certain it was the same men behind both. Andrew was cornered, too deep in the system to escape, too weak to fight those above him. His small kitchen became a battleground for money and power, and Andrew never realized the truth, that his life had already been weighed and marked as an acceptable price in this ruthless game. The men who came for Andrew Foster that night were not just street thugs. They were members of a coordinated criminal outfit, what prosecutors would later call the Crew. It was an organization with a hierarchy, with roles carefully divided, built for one purpose: control through fear. At the top of the pyramid stood 39-year-old Yousef Wynn, the brain, the strategist, the man pulling the strings, often from the shadows. It was Wynn who designed the brutal system of taxing dealers, demanding cuts of their profits under threat of violence. And it was Wynn who gave the orders for the attacks. His enforcer, his right hand, was 33-year-old Kenneth "Kenny" Fawcett, a ruthless career criminal. The man who carried out even the dirtiest commands. Fawcett was the one holding the ammonia bottle. It was his hands that delivered the most savage acts of violence. The Crew's muscle was 33-year-old John Ruthless. He was brought in as backup for the most dangerous jobs. Fawcett's partner in 3 recent raids, including the fatal one. Ruthless wasn't just a fighter. He was the cleaner, the one who torched a getaway car to erase the evidence. The youngest member was 22-year-old Josh Hawthorne. He didn't take part in the assaults directly, but his role was just as crucial. He was the link, the coordinator, passing Wynn's instructions to the foot soldiers and helping plan each move. Together, they formed a lethal quartet where the hard-earned criminal experience of the older men merged with the recklessness of youth. What bound them wasn't loyalty, it was ambition, a shared obsession with absolute control over their territory, a control enforced not with words, but with fear and inhuman cruelty. The motive behind this bloody reign of violence was not personal hatred, it was business. Cold, calculated. The logic of Yousef Wynn rested on a single concept from the criminal underworld: taxing. In Wynn's world, any dealer who sold his product automatically became his debtor. They owed him a cut, payment for the privilege of working on his territory. It was, in essence, a criminal franchise. But the price of disobedience wasn't just the loss of business. It was violence. If someone paid late or tried to skim profits, Wynn's tax collectors would arrive to claim their due by force. But these were no ordinary enforcers. Their weapon of choice wasn't fists or knives. It was something designed not just to injure, but to break the will, to instill primal terror. Their weapon was ammonia. The choice was deliberate. Ammonia is a caustic chemical, a substance that inflicts excruciating pain on contact with the human body. Sprayed into the face, it sears the cornea, blinding the victim, temporarily or forever. It burns through skin, and worse, inhaled, it tears apart lung tissue, suffocating its target from the inside. The agony it caused was indescribable. Its damage, not only physical, but psychological, leaving victims scarred in ways no wound could ever heal. By using ammonia, Wynn's gang was sending an unmistakable message to the entire underworld. We won't just take your money. We'll take your sight, your breath, your face. Fear became their currency, and they paid it out generously to anyone reckless enough to stand in their way. The killing of Andrew Foster was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the bloody exclamation mark at the end of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror, a campaign unleashed by Wynn's crew in August 2023. It began on August 9th in South Shields. The target, a small-time dealer who owed Wynn money. Wynn and Fawcett came to his home themselves. When the man opened the door, Fawcett didn't say a word. He simply sprayed ammonia into his face, in front of his family. They left without taking a thing. It wasn't a robbery. It was a demonstration of power. 3 days later, August 12th, the violence escalated. Fawcett and Ruthless went to Hebburn to punish another dealer. But the door was answered not by their target, but by a friend, a man with no ties to the drug trade. That didn't matter. They doused him in ammonia, leaving him with devastating burns to his eyes. But the most horrifying episode came on August 16th in Jarrow. Their intended victim, another dealer, crippled, his leg broken, unable to defend himself. When Fawcett and Ruthless stormed in, his partner, Nicola Dixon, tried to shield him. For that act of courage, she paid the ultimate price. Twice, ammonia was sprayed directly into her face. The damage was catastrophic. She lost vision in her left eye, and doctors were later forced to remove it entirely. 3 attacks in just 1 week. Each one more violent, more merciless than the last. By the time August 20th arrived, Wynn's crew had already drowned their world in terror, proving, again and again, that there were no limits to their cruelty. And it had become clear, they would not stop until blood was spilled. The night of August 20th was Andrew Foster's last. Just after 11 o'clock, a grey Volkswagen Golf, the gang's calling card, pulled up silently near his home. Inside were Kenneth Fawcett and John Ruthless, the executioners, sent to carry out the death sentence handed down by their boss. The knock on the door was ordinary, almost polite. Andrew opened it, never suspecting the threat that stood outside. Fawcett's reaction was instant. A jet of ammonia blasted into Andrew's face before he had the chance to comprehend what was happening. The world around him collapsed into chaos. Fire in his lungs, blindness in his eyes, suffocation with every breath. Stumbling backwards, choking, he managed only to rasp one word to his girlfriend upstairs: ammonia. Then he fell. His agony did nothing to slow the attackers. They stepped over his writhing body with chilling calm and went straight to the kitchen. Their goal was not money, it was tools. The equipment Andrew used to make cannabis edibles, the stash of product he had left behind. Methodically, they gathered what they came for. And then, just as calmly, they walked out, leaving Andrew to die on his own floor. Katie, his girlfriend, rushed downstairs at the sound of the struggle. What she saw was a nightmare. The man she loved fighting for every breath, his life draining away by the second. Her frantic call to emergency services, her desperate attempts at CPR. All of it was in vain. At the hospital, doctors fought for him, but the chemical burns in his lungs were too severe. By the next day, Andrew Foster's heart stopped. The score had been settled. When the first police patrols arrived at Avon Terrace, they were met with a scene both chaotic and deceptively clean. The chaos was in Andrew Foster's dying lungs, in the panic of his girlfriend, but for forensic investigators, the house was a nightmare. The weapon itself, ammonia, was volatile. By the time specialists began their work, most of the chemical evidence had already evaporated. The killers left no fingerprints. There were no direct witnesses. It was what detectives call a quiet crime. The first leads were almost nothing. The home's own CCTV cameras proved useless. All they had were fragments. A grainy clip from a street camera showing a car, resembling a grey Volkswagen Golf. making an unusual maneuver shortly before the attack. An audio recording from another camera, faint screams, and the roar of an engine pulling away. It wasn't much. In fact, it was catastrophically little. What began as an assault investigation now escalated into a murder case after Foster's death. The pressure on detectives multiplied overnight. They were up against cold-blooded, meticulous killers, men who seemed to have planned everything, leaving almost no trace behind. To find them, investigators would have to plunge deep into the shadows of South Tyneside's drug trade. And there, somewhere in that underworld, they would need to find the needle in a haystack, the one thread that could lead them to the killers before the crew struck again. In every complex investigation, there comes a moment when fortune finally turns in favor of the detectives. In the case of Andrew Foster's murder, that moment came at an ordinary gas station on John Reed Road. Less than 2 hours after leaving Andrew to die, Kenneth Fassett and John Wandless, intoxicated by their own sense of impunity, made a fatal mistake. They stopped for drinks. Their grey Volkswagen Golf pulled directly beneath the high-definition cameras. And those cameras captured everything. The footage showed the driver, John Wandless, in such sharp detail that detectives could make out every line of the tattoo on his neck. But the real breakthrough wasn't just visual. It was audio. The microphones picked up Wandless speaking casually to his partner. "Kenny, do you want anything?" And the reply came, clear as day. "Strawberry yogurt drink." That was it. Kenny. Police instantly connected the name to a man they already knew, Kenneth Fassett. In a single moment, the faceless killers now had names and faces. The gas station stop, so ordinary, so careless, became the key piece of evidence. Soon after, the case grew even stronger. Cell tower data confirmed that both men's phones had been in the area of Foster's home at the time of the attack. The puzzle was finally coming together. The killers' arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable, had betrayed them. One short stop for drinks shattered their carefully constructed plan and handed detectives the thread that would unravel the entire conspiracy. As detectives closed in on the killers, in the small community of Rectington, grief turned into something quieter, but no less profound. The place where the tragedy struck soon became an improvised memorial. Flowers appeared at the fence outside Andrew's home. Cards of condolence. Candles flickering in the night. These were not just formal gestures. They were attempts, fragile, human attempts, to make sense of the cruelty that had invaded their quiet world. To the people of Rectington, Andrew Foster was not a name in a case file. He was Andy, a son, a partner, a friend. His girlfriend, Katie Harrison, the one who found him on that horrific night, spoke of a man she had built her life around, a man she dreamed of growing old with. In one instant, her world was destroyed. In court, Andrew's mother delivered words that silenced the room. She spoke of endless hours spent by his hospital bedside, of hope slipping away day by day, and of the hollow emptiness that took root in her heart after his death. Her statement that the family was completely broken was not just a condemnation of the killers. It was an indictment of the entire world of violence that had stolen her son. Friends organized a release of balloons in his memory, calling his death senseless. These small, fragile acts of mourning stood in stark contrast to the cold, calculated reality in which his killers lived. They showed the truth behind every headline in the crime pages. That behind the statistics, behind the courtroom drama, there is real human pain. Pain that cannot be measured in money, nor erased by prison sentences. With the evidence stacked beyond dispute, police made their move. The takedowns were fast, precise, merciless. John Wandless was the first to fall. Arrested in the flat of an acquaintance, not long after, Kenneth Fawcett drove straight into a trap. His car was boxed in by unmarked police vehicles, leaving him nowhere to run. The so-called coordinator, Josh Hawthorne, was seized in Jarrow. On his phone, detectives uncovered messages that spelled out his role in planning the attacks. Undeniable proof. And then there was the leader, Yousef Wynn. At dawn, armed tactical units stormed his home. The arrest was clean, without incident. But in the interrogation room, Wynn was defiant, refusing to cooperate. His silence, however, could change nothing. By July 2024, all 4 men stood trial at Newcastle Crown Court. The defence fought hard. Wynn's lawyers claimed he had given no direct orders. The defence for the enforcers argued their identities were never properly established. But it was all smoke against a wall of evidence: cell tower data, crystal clear CCTV from a petrol station, and the testimonies of victims from earlier attacks. Piece by piece, the prosecution dismantled the lies. The judge, after hearing every argument, delivered his words like a hammer blow. This was murder for profit, a campaign of terror, and with that, the web the gang had spun for so long snapped shut around them. The day of sentencing marked the final chapter in this grim saga. As the judge read out his decision, he underscored the exceptional cruelty and cold-blooded nature of the crimes. Each man's punishment reflected the role he played in this deadly conspiracy. Yousef Wynn, 39 years old. The mastermind, the architect of the operation. Convicted of murder and conspiracy to inflict grievous bodily harm, his fate, life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 33 years, before parole could even be considered. Kenneth Fawcett, 33, the chief enforcer, the man whose hands carried out the violence. He too received life, with a minimum of 32 years. John Wandless, 33, the muscle, Fawcett's partner in Brutality, tasked with cleaning up the traces of their crimes. His punishment, life, with a minimum of 31 years. And then, the youngest of them all, Josh Hawthorne, just 22 years old, the coordinator. He never wielded the knife, but his role in planning made him indispensable to the scheme. His sentence, life, with a minimum of 22 years. In the British justice system, a life sentence is not a guarantee of eventual release. Even after serving the minimum term, freedom is not automatic. A parole board must decide whether the offender still poses a danger to society. For these 4 men, the reality is stark. They will spend the prime years of their lives behind bars, paying for the night they chose to place ambition above a human life. The message was clear. The brutality of Britain's gangs would no longer be met with silence.